Okay, hello everyone. So this is the web page grid design tutorial for our distance presence project. Remember, essentially what we're doing for this project is we have the QR code enhanced business card that connects to a profile website. This is the profile website. Now, as I mentioned in class, we are looking at this a little bit early because it may be the trickiest thing that we do, just in the sense of you may not have had exposure to creating web pages before. With visual print documents like our covers, even our business card, you get it, right? I mean, it is what it looks like. You can assemble different design objects to produce the overall document. This, you're dealing a little bit with code, so it's not always exactly clear how things are composited and then how they appear. So this might be the trickiest thing that we'll do, depending on your experience. But don't worry, we're going to watch this tutorial. We're going to have opportunity in class to do production workshops. So, we're going to be going through this kind of step by step. And I am going to be giving you some default materials that you'll be able to use to modify. Those will be the things that we're actually going to be working with in this tutorial. So let's go ahead and get started so this doesn't take too long. So a couple of things we're going to be looking at. We are, in this case, designing for the screen. Previously, we've been designing for print. Now we're turning to screen design, and that does have different implications, even in things like color space, which our reading pointed out. But also, a print document, you can pretty well ensure this is how it's going to look, right? You have a print copy of it. Screen design can be a little different, particularly web design, because you can't always guarantee this is exactly how it's going to look, depending on the different devices that users have to access your design. We're going to be looking at HTML and CSS. So we'll have a brief overview of what that is. But basically, those are languages or codes. I mean, they're just written in plain text. We'll see examples that describe to a web browser like Chrome or Firefox or, heaven forbid, Internet Explorer or Safari. They tell the browser, here's what the web page should look like and here's what it should contain. So we'll look at those. Also, we're going to be dealing in grid design. So even if you have some exposure to web design, we want to be working in our grid design techniques. There are lots of ready-made grid structures available on the web. The one we're using, I just built because it's a lot more simple. And if it's your first exposure to both web design and grid design, it can be a little overwhelming because that's two sort of separate things, right? You could be a very good web designer and have little experience with grid design, or vice versa. So we're kind of talking about some different skills, so I try to make it as streamlined as possible. Okay, so to begin, what is HTML and CSS? Well, HTML, let me just drag this over. HTML is the code or the language that underpins virtually every web page you'll encounter, at least now. So, here's our course website. If you want to see the HTML of this, you usually can in your browser just by viewing the page source. This is the actual code that translates into our home page. Now, this looks very abstract, right? There's a bunch of punctuation and numbers. This is a fairly complicated page because this wasn't written by anybody. It wasn't written by a human. It's written on demand by a program on a server, and we'll look at that briefly just in a second. But so this looks super complicated and super long, but all this is numbers, text, punctuation, that sort of thing. You can see up here, maybe not on the video so closely, but this is an HTML document. HTML stands for Hypertext Machine Language. It's just a kind of code that our web browsers can understand. So it's really the underpinning of basically everything you'll encounter on the World Wide Web. So a complicated page like this, a very simple page, right? This is my first web page, not mine, but hypothetically, with this blue background. If we look at the code here, view page source, much simpler, but it's actually structurally identical. See the same kind of structural things, like putting particular definitions in, angle brackets, defining what kind of document it is. Those are identical. So this page, although its code is much simpler in a way, it's structurally identical to this. Just another example. So this is like Yahoo's page. Same thing, view page source. Again, same structural features, just a lot more code. And again, this is a page that no one actually sat down and wrote this code out. It's actually generated by the server itself whenever you go to this website. This one, of course, was handwritten by someone, me, just as an example. Just sat down and wrote this out. So that's those. So that's kind of what HTML is. It's the code or the language, however you want to phrase that, that underpins web pages. So let me just show you this really quick. What is then CSS? We know a little bit about HTML. Let's talk just a little bit about how the web works and its history. So let's say this is you, this little stick figure. And let's say you want to go to a particular website, you know, our course website, that my first website, the Yahoo homepage, whatever. Basically what you're going to do in your browser is you type something into your URL bar up here, or you search for it. But ultimately, you're going to kind of address, right? Something that starts with HTTP or S. It's Hypertext Transfer Protocol. And what that does, and I'm simplifying a whole lot, but basically what happens is there's a computer somewhere. It's a lot like the computer you probably use, but it doesn't look the same. I mean, it has the same components basically, but it doesn't look the same. They're usually, a lot of them, all consolidated in one place. These are called servers. And that's really, there's nothing magical about a server. In fact, you can use your own machine as a server. But think about the differences here. If there's a web page on a server and it's, you know, your computer, sometimes you have to turn your computer off, right? So then people couldn't get to it. A server is always running, sitting there, waiting for someone to talk to it. Let's say this is the, you know, our course homepage, so it's on Google's servers. This is me, and I say I'd like to see our course homepage. I basically talk to it. Oops, I don't do that. There we go. I ask it for a web page, and it gives it back to me. Let me just make sure this is yeah. And it delivers it to me in HTML. So we'll just go ahead and put HTML on this document. Now, in the earlier days of the web, HTML handled everything. That means not only the content, so the actual stuff that's on the page. You know, if we look at our, excuse me, our example, there's content on here, right? Words, in some cases there are images. That's what content is, the stuff that's actually on a page. But there's also the format of it, right? This gray background, this text is larger than this text. There are different boxes up here. That's all a question of format, right? It's both content and form. In the early days of the web, HTML handled all of this. You just code in what it's supposed to look like and what's supposed to go in there. In the early days, that was okay, but we started bumping into problems as the web increased in sort of scope and importance. You know, different problems like, well, there were some things you just couldn't do. You know, with web pages. They weren't as interactive as they are now. So some companies, most notably Microsoft, and that's why I made that joke about Internet Explorer earlier, they just started building in stuff into that actual HTML code that only their browser understood. It lets you do particular things, but you had to use Internet Explorer to do it. And also, there were other things that grew out of that, like it was, they didn't really think too much about security. But so that was an issue. It's like HTML couldn't do everything we wanted it to do. But there were other problems. Let's say, I mean, if you have one page, my first web page or whatever, let's pull that up. No, I can't remember where I put that. Then that's just one page. It doesn't take much to change it or anything like that. But what if we wanted to change that blue background to a red background or something? You know, we could just go in there and change it. But if instead of one web page, you had tons of these. Like, you know, you had your front page and this page and your index page, and you have a gallery page and you have a contact page. I mean, most websites are websites. They have lots of pages. Our site has, you know, a handful. You'd think it's just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, but it's not, because there's all these different sub things underneath it, right? You know, these projects page has a bunch of different sub pages, so there's a lot of different pages here. What if I wanted to change this gray background or make the font 1 point larger or something like that? I'd have to go into every single one of these and change that in the HTML. And that opens the door up to human problem. You know, I might forget one, you know, that kind of thing. I might make a mistake. It just opens the door up to problems. And then there's other issues involved in this as well, which is, and if we think about the context, right, the conditions of use, the occasions of use, in the early days of the web, most everyone was going to just be accessing web pages through their computer. So we'd know pretty much what their screen resolution might be. We know they're sitting pretty close to it. We know they're going to be using a mouse and a keyboard. Those context issues are pretty well controlled. But as the web started to expand, we couldn't guarantee, okay, they're going to be accessing our website through their computer. They could be using a mobile device. And in the early days of mobile devices, the bandwidth was so much less than a hard line that, you know, I mean, you couldn't deliver something that had a lot of graphics. It would take forever. Nowadays, bandwidth on mobile devices, it's pretty good. I mean, it's basically comparable to a computer. But in the early days, that wasn't the case. So a lot of times we had to present a different page, a whole different site for a web device. Now, if you've got this many pages, and you have to make, okay, I have to copy this entire thing just in case someone is using a mobile device. Or what if they're using, I don't know, their television? We had web TV back in the day, which has kind of come back in different ways through things like game consoles and boxes like Roku. Or what about people who are visually impaired, for example, and they're using a special kind of browser? You'd have to copy your entire site for all of these different devices, right? And anytime you wanted to make any little change, you had to do it in every page, in every copy. So this obviously is not good. This is not optimal. So we had to think about how to handle these kinds of issues, right? The issue of how do we make it so that we can do stuff we can't do right now in HTML? Can we make it so that we don't have to change every single little web page if we want to make a change? Can't we do that just in one spot and be done with it? And then third, different devices. How do we manage that? So this is where CSS came into the picture. And CSS is an acronym for Cascading Style Sheets. You don't exactly have to know what that means. It basically means that you can set particular formats, and then you can make little tweaks further down that are more specific, but there's this kind of overarching structure to everything. So in the original days of HTML, we had form and content together. We got to a point where that just wasn't great. It wasn't workable. So to solve a lot of these problems, we decided, why don't we split up the form and the content, right? Then, if we have a bunch of HTML pages in our site, right? So we copy that. Instead of each one of these saying, here's the content and here's the form, why don't we just make a separate kind of document? Let me drag this over. And I'd prefer that one that looks like a page. And instead of putting the form and content in the HTML page, let's split off the form to be handled by something else, and that's CSS. So now, if I wanted to change this background to green or red or blue, or make this font size 1 point larger, instead of changing each individual page, I just have to change it once here, and every one of these pages knows that change has been made because it's connected to this CSS document. These HTML documents and CSS documents work in tandem. The HTML document says, okay, here's my content, but in terms of form, you're going to have to talk to this thing up here. It handles all the presentation stuff. All I do is handle the content, the actual text, images, stuff like that, video even. But how it's presented, that's handled up here. So now when we want to make a change to our entire website, do it once here in the CSS and it's done, right? Of course, you still have to change individual content in here. There's no real way around that, but formal issues consolidated in one place. And this also solves our third problem of different kinds of devices, because each HTML page can be associated with more than one CSS page. So why would I want to do this? Well, if people are visiting my site through a desktop computer, I might associate it with this CSS page. My server is going to be smart enough to know when they come in what device they're using. So it's going to say, use this CSS. This one's for desktop computers, right? But if someone accesses my website and they're using something like a mobile browser, it's going to say, same content, but just use this presentation, right? Maybe the actual order of things is different. We've seen mobile sites where they actually change, right? Based on whether you're looking at them on your smartphone or on a desktop computer. So you can associate HTML pages with multiple CSS pages. You know, we could do this for lots of reasons. What if I wanted to have a separate CSS page for print? You know, if you try and print this, it's going to get all these buttons and this sidebar over here. What if I want, when someone goes to print the page, it formats it differently, like this, right? This is because our website, perhaps you didn't know this, has a separate CSS page that knows when I try to print, and it strips out all that extra stuff. It puts it in this nice little printable format. So that's an overview of how CSS and HTML work together. Now, for our purposes, all we're doing is creating one HTML page and one CSS page. CSS is going to hold the format. HTML is going to hold the content. Okay? There. And these two things work together. So that's what we're going to be doing. And as I said, this stuff already exists on the web. For example, if you take a look at the code on our web page here, you'll notice there will be links to CSS, excuse me, CSS pages, right? It's going to be referring to them already. If we look at a much simpler site, which we'll do in a second, the HTML is going to be connected to a CSS site that tells it how to present the content. So let's move these out of here. So what I'm going to be giving you is a folder, a directory with some different things in it. There's going to be an index page and a style page, a CSS page. If we open this, this is what it looks like. And this is intentionally hideous so that we can see where different elements of the page start and stop, right? If we look at the elements of this page, we can see there's a sea green background. We've got this kind of header up here with main title text that's gold, subtitle text that's aqua, header text that's a dark green with a dotted line under it. And we can start to see rows, right? This is set up in grid structure. So we've got actually a few different rows. This thing turns out to be a row. This is a row. And then we've got some that are colored differently. We've got a blue row here and a red row here. And this sort of background gray color. Take a sip of water here. There we go. And you can see the column structure is already in place too, right? We know we've got 10 columns. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And we can see how those sort of go across the page. You don't have to use all 10 columns. In this second row, we've got about 3 columns being taken up by this dog picture. One column here with text. This lorem ipsum, that's just dummy text. Lorem ipsum is used in the design field when you don't have actual text. You just put it in place as a holder. Excuse me, then we can see how it stretches across a few columns here. It looks like 3, and then 3 columns here. So we can see how this grid structure lines up, right? All the way down the page. Here's a column, here's a column, here's a column. So this is our default page, and as I mentioned, it is ugly intentionally so we can see the different parts really clearly. And we can look at the code right here. This is all it is. We can see some of the same structural elements, and we can also see these different parts down here, which we'll get into, breaking things into rows, and then inside of the rows into columns. You can see it's linked CSS pages right here. If you click on that, well, it doesn't want to bring it up in the browser. This is what it looks like. This is what CSS pages look like. They're a little more human readable in that you define different elements and then you give them different aspects. So let's just close this out. And as I mentioned, I'm going to be giving you this index page. All right, I've got too many windows open here. And its associated CSS. So what we're going to do right now is we're just going to kind of step how to create this. We're going to start with a blank one and then move to how to assemble this page. Okay, so now because these are just text, right? They're just code. You can actually produce HTML pages in anything that can edit text. That's all this is. There's nothing magical behind it. It's just words. That's all it is. Now, that being said, there are some programs that will help you by doing things like differently coloring parts that should be together, showing you a mock-up as you go. They help you kind of understand the code a little bit better. A good example, one that we have, is Dreamweaver. You may have used this before. If you create just a blank page in Dreamweaver, you can see just the code. If you click split up here, you can see part of the code and then how it appears on the page, or you can see just how it appears on the page. So you may have used this or something like this before. I'm going to go ahead and close this one out. I'm going to open our page. Okay. And now you can see what I'm talking about. So this is the code up here, and there's all the code. This is how it looks visually. And you can see there's a split window here. So code up top, how it looks visually down below. And with these little code split design buttons, you can decide which view you want. We tend to use the split in the beginning more because then you can see how things are happening in the code. Another thing to point out about Dreamweaver, so I opened up that index page. It automatically, if you can see on the video, also opens up this little thing that says style.css. It knows that those two things are linked, so it opens up both of them together. You see how that works? This is the actual HTML code. This is the CSS code. Here's the content. Here's the form. It knows those two things are associated together because it reads this thing right here. And so it opens it up for me. So this is what we're shooting for. As I said, we're going to start with a blank page and just build this kind of step by step, just so that we can see how we got to this. For that reason, I made this other thing called index 2. And this is what it looks like. It's just a blank page. This is all of its code. Now, it is associated with the same style sheet, style.css. So any changes I make there, it's going to affect both of these HTML pages. Okay, so I know you're kind of overwhelmed, perhaps. I don't know, maybe you're perfectly up to date with this. But the point here is all we're dealing with is this code. And this code I'm going to give you. We're going to watch right now how we can actually manipulate this code to get the kinds of effects we want. We're starting with just a blank page. And the reason why it's called index, that's a special name. You don't have to use index. Really, the only thing about HTML pages named index is that servers know to look for those pages as the first page that they'll show. So when you go to google.com, it has an index page, a page named index, and it automatically looks for that. If it's not there, usually servers will say, I can't find it. Sometimes they'll look for things with different names. But there's nothing magical necessarily about the name index, except it is this one special name that servers know to look for. Index 2, there's nothing special about that. That little 2 changes everything. It's just like any other page. So we can kind of see how this works. And this code up here, you're not going to need to tweak. It's basically just sort of default stuff that this is in English. This is the character encoding UTF-8. You do want to change this thing that says title, your page title here. So we'll call this, my page. Okay. And what that does is you might notice at the top of pages, there's always this little thing in the browser, depending on what you're using. Do you see on this tab, it says ENG 319 document design? That's where that title is actually defined. So mine now is called My Page. We know it's linked to style.css. And we don't have to talk about this too much, but this index page is in the same directory or folder with its style page. That's how this works. It's telling it, hey, look in the same directory for something called style.css. If I move my style page, like out of this directory, or if I move my index page, and this code hasn't been updated, it's not going to be able to find it. Because right now it's telling it, look in the same folder that you're in, this index page, for something called style.css. You don't need to meddle with this for our purposes. Then we see we've got what's called the body here, and that's where all of our content is going to go. If I was just going to sit here and type words here on the page, you can see it goes into the body, right? This is what it looks like through a web browser. This is the actual code. So let's go ahead and take a look at the elements of our page here. I'm going to pull this up in a browser. So we've got, as we mentioned, the background, the different rows, the different columns. So how are we going to go ahead and build those? The first thing is we have that green background. What we want to do is kind of start with these large-scale page things, right? This affects the whole page, this background, and then move in tighter to rows and columns and that kind of stuff. So how do we get this color back here? Well, we have to associate this body element with something in our CSS that's going to be defining that. In CSS here, I've already set up this thing that says page. And here it's defining the background color is dark sea green. We know from our reading that you can define colors a lot of different ways. Well, there's two principal ways, really. One is through, as our book pointed out, hexadecimal code. And there are tons of color pickers that you can just find online that will find colors for you and then give you the hexadecimal, right? So if I wanted to use this shade of red, here's the hexadecimal code. It's FF000. Watch what happens when I change dark sea green to that. And I'm going to save it. I'll go back to this. Okay, nothing, right? Nothing's changed. Why didn't that change this color to red? Well, it's because I haven't hooked these two things up yet. This is being defined in the page element here. So what I have to do is tell my HTML code that I want you to connect to that defined element, this page element. So let me just go ahead and refresh that. Bam, there's that red. Wow, and that is super, super red. You can see why I used dark sea green. So you can use hexadecimal coloring. That's a lot more fine-grained. I mean, that's what you end up using, because it gives you every color possibly. But some colors have special names. And I used that just so it's much easier for us to tell where things are, right? So I used dark sea green, I used gold, I used aqua. I just used name colors, but you can use hexadecimal. So I've changed it back to dark sea green. I'm going to save that. Go to my source code here. Bam, it's back to the sea green. And now my body, this whole page, has been associated with everything defined here. So we've got background coloring, we've got margin and padding that has to do with the page itself, its margins. It defines what font family we're using. So tray is what it's going to look for first. If that's not there, it's going to look for some other ones. It also defines things like the header text. This is page H1, and it defines things like the margin, padding, font size, line height, and alignment and color of things that take the H1 tag. And what are those? Well, we know it's gold, so if we look on our page here, it's this. What we tend to do, and this is associated with our principle of order that we've read about, is we have different levels of headers. H1 means header 1. That should be the most prominent, the biggest, the most visible. Then we step down to H2, H3, which is a decreasing level of prominence in the order. You can go down as far as, I believe, H6, but you tend not to. You only have a few, usually. We can see how ours are being defined, right? H1, it's this gold stuff. So that's that one up here. Our code for H2, it's the aqua one. And we can see the font size is smaller. It's 100% rather than 400%. Its line height is 10%. So it's, the leading is much, much tighter. That's what line height is. It's leading, really. And it's aqua, so it's this one. Our H3 is this one, and it's slightly different, right? Same margin, same padding, which was 0. Its font size is 140, so curiously, it's actually bigger than H2. Its alignment is left, its color is green, and it also has this thing that says border bottom, 1 pixel dashed, and it gives a color code there. So if we look at how that plays out, oops, wrong page. This is that 1 pixel border bottom that's dashed, and its color is a kind of grayish color, right? So you don't need to know all this stuff. I'm going to be giving you this, but watch what happens when we change stuff, right? Let's say I don't want that border there. I'm going to delete it. I'm going to save. Well, let's refresh this page. See how that little dotted line disappeared? Because we can change stuff in the CSS, and it's going to change how the content is presented. It doesn't change the content. It changes how it's presented. I'm going to go ahead and put that line back, but I'm going to change its color to red. And I'm going to make it 5 pixels to make it super ugly. Right, so 5 pixels dashed red. I'm just going to save here, reload here, bam. Okay, so you can see how those changes play out. Keep going to the wrong thing. So we've got our background. Now what we need to start doing is building the other elements of it, right? This row up here, this row with a bunch of columns in it. I'm going to be giving you this actual code, but we're going to be building it here, just sort of copy and paste so that we can do it one at a time. The first thing we have to do, curiously, is build this whole thing, because this is a container that's holding our different rows and columns. To make things nice and tidy, we want to put it inside a container. And this container is going to have this gray background. It's going to say how wide this whole thing is. So that's already provided for us. Here in the CSS, it has defined the container. Okay, so if I look in our finished code, you can see how this works. It has this thing that says div ID container. That's how you tell the web page, here's where something is. Div stands for division. It means part of a page. So I'm going to go ahead and put that in there, div ID container. And because the ID is container, it's automatically associated with the CSS where container is defined here. It knows to clear out the margins. It knows to give it a certain amount of padding. It gives it this gray background, and it sets its width at 820 pixels. So the width of this page is hard-coded. No matter how you shrink or stretch this page, that width is going to stay the same because it's set at 120. See? It doesn't get wider or smaller. You can program variable widths. That's interesting for columns. It's easier to have fixed widths for columns. Anywho, So now in our source code, I've defined that. The one thing I haven't done is you may notice that all of these tags, they have to end somewhere, right? You've got head up here, and here the head has been ended with this little slash. Same thing with the body. It starts here, ends here with the slash. Even with the whole HTML page, ends here, starts up here. That's true about everything. In HTML code, you've got to start it and you got to end it. So the same thing's true about our div ID container here, our container division. So I'm going to go ahead and end this, and Dreamweaver actually will help you out. It's one of the reasons why using something like Dreamweaver is helpful. It actually will finish this for you. It'll point out, hey, you haven't finished your stuff. And it helps you complete that. Watch what happens when I just simply type a less than sign, an angle bracket, and a slash. See how I didn't do that. It automatically completed div because it knows that this is open. Okay? So now when I refresh, you can see there's my container. It's not nearly as long as it is on our page because we haven't put anything inside it yet. Right? If I preview the browser, yes, see, we're getting there, but there's nothing actually in our container yet. It's gray, it's got a certain amount of padding, but there's nothing in there. So we're going to start dropping in these different rows and columns now. And as I said, I'm going to be providing all this code, but we want to do it sort of step by step so that we can see how these things interact together. Okay, so I'm going to drop something, and it has to go inside of this container. It's not after the container, it's not before it, it's actually inside it. And you can see in the example HTML that that's perfectly fine. You can open up more divisions inside of existing divisions. So here we've got the container, it's the whole thing. Then underneath, we're opening up this thing called div class row standard row 20. That's this first row. When I click on it, it actually highlights it. You can kind of see the dotted line around it here. So that's what we're going to be doing, is starting our first row. And so I can copy and paste that over just to sort of show us how that works. I'm going to put it inside of my container. And interestingly, in HTML, it doesn't matter how many line breaks there are here. It doesn't matter if there's a bunch of spaces. It doesn't really understand those. It just looks at code. So it doesn't have to be, you know, if you hit return a billion times, it doesn't matter. It's perfectly the same for HTML. So I've opened up my row here, row standard, row 120. I'm going to go ahead and close that off. And you can see what's happened. Row standard, row 20, row 120, that connects to something again in our CSS. You can see these words we're using. These show up in our CSS, and they tell the browser, here's how this should look. So row standard, it's telling it these things, right? 10 pixels of padding, it's 820 pixels, so all the way across our container. No margins. That's what it's telling it there. And it's telling it row 120. Now, our grid system is based on multiples of 30 for our rows. You can see this here. We've got row 30, row 60, and the only thing that that's defining is the actual height of the row. 30 pixels, 60 pixels, 90 pixels, 120 pixels. It only goes up to 240. If we wanted a larger row, we could just write one in. Row, and what we're doing here is defining what's called a class. A division should only be used once in a page. A class can be used as many times as you'd like. But let's bump this up to 270 to stick with our thing. I'm going to go ahead and put height 270. I'm sorry, 270 pixels. And I'll close this off. Okay, just gonna make that tidier. Okay, so we've added, oops, and I used the wrong thing here. There we go. So now we've added a row 270. If I wanted to, now since this exists, I can go back to my source code, call this row 270, and watch what happens. Blam, now it's 270 pixels high rather than the 120 that it was before. Now I can't just write anything I want in here, like 100, because see, we haven't defined row 100. We certainly could if we wanted to, but we haven't yet. So you can't just automatically write something in here. You have to actually put it in the CSS. Watch what happens when I refresh here. It can't find that, so it does nothing with it. It just overlooks it. Row 120, it knows exactly what that is. Okay, it's 120 pixels high. I've got my div set up here, and we'll move a little bit quicker here so this doesn't take forever. We know this main title stuff is in here, and it's in gold. But again, since this is the HTML, I just have to put the content, right? The CSS is going to handle the size of the font, what font it is, the color, all of that stuff. One thing I do have to do is all of our rows are broken up into columns. I mentioned we've got 10 columns, as you can see down here. So I do have to tell the code here how many of those columns I'm using. I want this to go all the way across, so I'm using 10. So I'm going to go ahead and use this div class. And again, it doesn't come after the row. It's actually inside of it. And I'm telling it to use call standard, which is defined again here in our CSS, tells it the margins. And then I'm using calls 10, which again is just the width. We can see these go by, they're actually 60 pixels wide, but with a 20 pixel margin. So you'll notice they go by 80s, right? 60, 140, 210. That's the fixed width of our columns. So I know I want to use calls 10, which means all 10 of the columns all the way across. And I'll go ahead and close this one out as well. And all I'm going to do is put my title in here. Boom. And now let's go ahead and save this out. And there it is. There's our main title. I put it in H1, and we remember that our H1 was defined up here. Every H1 on the page is going to have this same kind of formatting, gold, 400% height, that kind of stuff. Now watch what happens if I change this, right? What if I didn't put these H1 tags around it? What if I just wrote main title? What happens then? Blam. There's nothing defined for that, so it just has the default text, right? You can write like this, but it's not going to do that line height, the font size, the color. I have to make sure I put the appropriate tags there. In this case, H1. In order for it to be formatted properly. Okay? So that's how that works. We're just going to go ahead and copy and paste over a couple other things because we've got our main title, we've got this subtitle here, and then this header. And these are all actually separate rows. So we've got, we know that our column here ends with our div. Oh, the subtitle actually is not a separate row. This is all one row. So I can put H2 in my same column. Fresh. I'm going to use this command up here that calls it's called apply source formatting. That makes everything look tidy. So I'm just going to click that, and now everything looks a lot cleaner. See how it indents everything so that you can see where divisions start and stop, right? They start and stop on the same level of indent. So we've got our main title, our subtitle. That's one row, and that row is divided into all of the columns, right? It's spanning all of the columns. However, that row is closing out here. So we've already got that right here. So we want to go ahead and add another row. That's the thing that's going to contain this header. I'm just going to copy and paste that over. It's got div class row standard row 30, so it's telling it to use the row standard and the one that's 30 high. And div class, again, call standard calls 10 because it's using all 10 columns all the way across. It's got H3 in there, div. So I'm just going to copy this whole thing over. Plop that down. I'm going to format it so it looks clean. And there we go. If we save this and take a look at it in a browser, let that go ahead and load. You can see it's getting there, right? It's getting close. We've got our first 2 rows. This row had both our main title and our subtitle, spanned all 10 columns. It's got a second row that has the header in it. That spans all 10 columns. And we're going to do something here in a second to change that. But we're building sort of there. Now, why did I have these things span all 10 columns, even though they don't actually take up that much space? Well, watch what happens when I change the number of columns used in this row, the header row. So here's this. We can see we're dealing right here. Instead of calls 10, let's use, let's say just 4. So it's using calls 4. What happens when I refresh this? Do you see how it only spans as far as 4 columns? That means the red line only goes that far. So if I look at this in an actual browser, see, it only goes 4 columns in width. So even though I'm not using it to all 10 columns to hold the text, I still want to use all 10 columns so that the line spans the entire way. So I'm going to go ahead and change this back to 10. Okay, so now we start getting into some nitty-gritty, where here we're breaking things up into 10 columns. Here we've got a dog image and a few different columns. Remember that everything is based on this same grid. The row heights are always going to be multiples of 30, and we've got 10 columns that we can fill or not fill. But we always want to make sure that we're adding up to 10. You can see down here, in fact, we're using 10 individual columns, whereas in this row, we've got 3 columns, 1 column, 3 columns, 3 columns. So 3, 1, 3, 3, totals 10. All right, so this is going to get a little more complicated, but it's the exact same process. The first thing we want to do is define another row. So we're using row standard, row 60. That's all the same. But see how this one's colored blue? How did I do that? I defined in my CSS something called blue row. If we take a look, all I did was define a class called blue row and change the background to deep sky blue, another named color. So anything that has that class association, blue row, is going to have a blue background. I'm just going to copy this over. And now we're dealing, I believe, here. Let's close that out. So there's our blue row. Now we haven't defined any columns in it yet, right? So we're going to have to go back inside of our row and define that. Now, all we have to do here is define columns. So we've got, as before, call standard. This time, instead of 10, though, we're just going to use 1. And we're going to repeat that 10 times to add up to 10. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this over. Div class, call standard, call 1. It's got our text in there, lorem ipsum. Okay. And now you can see I've added 1 column. Now there's actually nothing stopping me from moving on. I don't actually have to put in 10 columns, but you do want to try and add up to 10 for consistency and positioning, right? I mean, some of the things we're doing, they're going to be positioned, like in this red row, all the way over. And the way we set that is through the number of columns we use. So I've only got 1 column being used here. I do want to use all 10, so I'm just going to paste this 9 more times. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Apply our source formatting. Boom. I've got my 10 columns. That's all I had to do. I just defined that blue row, right? Row standard. It's 60 high, although I could change that. Let's make it bigger. Let's call it row 90. Blam. Now it's 90 pixels high. And I associated blue row with it. If I delete blue row, it just goes back to being a normal row, which has this gray background. Okay? See, now it has a neutral background. That's because I defined in the CSS this thing called blue row. And it's not special just for this row. What if now I want to go back up and make my first row here a blue row? I can do that. Just going to scroll up here. This is my row standard, 120 high. I'll make this a blue row. And you can see how Dreamweaver helps you out. See how it knows the things that you've defined in your CSS, so it helps you complete it. I just typed B, right? And it suggests blue row. Is that what you want to use? So it makes it easy. It knows what you've defined in your CSS. If I try and put something that's not there, it doesn't help me out because, you know, this isn't a real thing, right? This isn't going to change anything. But if I start typing blue, oh, that's not closed out. Let me close it. There. So see, I can make any row a blue row. I also defined one called the red row, so I could do that as well. Call this red row. Bam. So I can assign those classes to anything, right? Now I'm going to go ahead and take it off just so that our product looks the same. So we've got that. Ooh, I'll go ahead and change this row back to 60. Remember, we're working in multiples of 30, so I could put this to 60 or 30 or whatever. I think it was 60. Yep, that's right. So there we go. That's essentially how this works. The rest of the stuff is just playing with different kinds of rows and columns. So we use 10 up here. Let's look at this next column. Now it's not red or blue, it's normal. And it's got 3 columns here being used for this cute dog picture. Then it's got 1 column of dummy text. Then it's got another 3 columns of dummy text and another 3 columns. So how do we set that up? Well, first we go to our row. And this is it. Row standard, it's 180 high. And then you can kind of see what's going on here. I'm just going to copy and paste this as I go. It's going to use, inside of that, it's going to break it into call standard calls 3. So it's going to use these first 3 columns. And then inside of that, it's placing this dog picture. Now, if you want, I just coded this in, but you can just use Dreamweaver's tools to do this. Insert media, I believe. Maybe it's, oh, it's image. That's what it is. Insert image. And let's say this is, oh yeah, this is gonna take a while to get there. Just a second, because it's buried in subfolders here. There we go. So there's our dog thing. You can put it in like that, and we'll put our alternate dog pic. And see, it's the exact same code, really. I just wrote it in by hand, but you can use Dreamweaver's tools to make that much easier. There's our dog picture. Now, following that, those first 3 columns, we close out our column division. Then we have one that's just 1 column, right? Followed by 3 columns, followed by 2. What if I want to change this a little bit? I still want it to add up to 10 at the end. So let's go ahead and change this one to columns 4, and this one to columns 2. Watch what happens right down here when I refresh. Okay, now this spans 4 columns, and this one spans 2 columns. Just because I changed the number here. These things have already been defined in the CSS, right here under our columns. So I just have to indicate which one I'm using. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this whole thing, this whole row, starting up here. Oops, I went over it. I bled into the next row. So it's right here is all it is, right? Columns 3, columns 1, columns 4, columns 2. So that's 10 inside of this row where we've got the dog picture and some dummy text. So I'm going to put that row under this row. And I'll apply my source formatting. There we go. And then just to clean things up, we know in this one, we've got one last row here where we're using, it looks like 4 columns, right? We can see 4 columns across in this red row, then 1 column, then another 3, and then 2 where we've put the dog picture. And we actually reduced the size of the dog picture. Here we can tell it's 150 pixels square. Here, it's actually 140 pixels square. That's going to make it fit in this space a lot better. That's because by default, our pictures are aligned to the left of whatever space it's in. That's defined in our CSS. Here where we define images, it's by default going to be going to the left. So unless we intentionally right align them, this is what's going to happen with them. No margin, no padding. There's an actual border around there. Watch what happens if I change this to, let's say, 10 pixels. And go back. See how that border got much bigger? Right, there's this big gray border. But we don't want that. So we'll put it back to 1. But that's what's going on for all images, right? They're all, just like any other content, they're controlled in the CSS. So this last red row here, it's being defined right here. So instead of blue row, this one is called red row, or it's using that class. Remember, we can use classes many, many times, as many times as you'd like. Divs you can only use once, however. Div IDs, classes you can use again and again. So this one's 150 high to accommodate our dog picture. We can see it's got, in terms of its columns, calls 4, calls 1 right here. You can see sort of below that's getting lit up. Calls 3 right here, and then calls 2 that has the dog picture inside it. The size of the dog picture has been changed from its default 150 to 140 here where it says width. I can actually control this further. Let's say I just wanted an even 100. See, and now it's still right aligned, right? And this is not all that great, so let's change that back to 140. But that's where the actual image size is being set. So let me just go ahead and copy this whole red row and paste it into our other page here. On my source formatting just to make it tidy. And there it is. If I didn't want to use this red row, I want to change that to blue row. Let me just go down in my code. Okay, just change this to blue row. And there it goes. Now, if I wanted to change this to something like purple row, I can't just write that here because it's going to be referring to my CSS page, and it doesn't exist. I haven't defined anything called purple row. Watch what happens. See, nothing, because it doesn't know of anything called purple row. I could go into my CSS page here and make a new one. Let's do that. Called purple row. Background, and we'll call it purple, which is a named color. You see, it actually gives you this little thing to pick colors as well, but I want to do that. And then I'll close it here. Okay, and now you can see we have defined something called purple row. Now I'm just using those words because they're easy to remember. I could call it, anything. I could call this, widget. It doesn't really matter what you call it. You just have to make sure that whatever's in the HTML exists in the CSS, right? So if I call this widget, there, see how it's gone back. Okay, so that's that. I'm going to go ahead and put red row back in here. I'm going to pull out this purple thing. And that's the gist of it. We basically just built this page essentially from scratch. Right? So there it is. This was our source one. And remember in our mock-up that we just produced, we did change this from 2 to 4 columns. So you can see the difference there. Excuse me, 3 to 4. But that's basically all there is to it. As I said, I realize this is tricky stuff. You probably haven't dealt with this before. Maybe you got a little lost in terms of what do you copy over. The good news is you can't break things so badly that they can't be fixed. All this is, it's just words. It's just straight up text. Right? This is all we've done here is write a few lines of text. Looks like it's about 83 lines of text. That's all this is. It's just basically telling a browser, okay, here's the content, and in terms of format, make sure to talk to this style CSS page in order to handle how it's going to be presented. That's all that's going on here. In class, we're going to be experimenting with this, how to actually kind of tinker with our grid structure, how to change colors, how to insert images. But basically, what we've done right now is build a grid design web page. Yes, of course, it's hideous, but that's because we want to clearly see different kinds of rows and different kinds of text features and that kind of thing. The principles we can now apply to make elegant pages, particularly given what we've now read in our book about grid design, about color, and about different design principles, right? We can see things like how order is being established and where the eye is being drawn. Okay, so our next step is to start working with this in class, which we're going to be doing. You're watching this a little bit earlier, or a little early, because we are going to be dealing with our business card in the near future. We're going to turn to our web page in a couple of weeks, but we will definitely be getting in-class time to work with this stuff. We'll definitely be seeing how these principles play out. Okay, that's it. I will see you guys later. If you want to, go ahead and start experimenting with this stuff. I'm going to make the files available, so you're allowed to sort of play around with this stuff. That's one of the best ways to learn, is just bonking around with files. You can't really break them terribly because I'll have copies. If you get into a place where you just don't know what's going on, we can always fix it. All right, I'll see you guys.